Hey guys, so I was at the used bookstore recently and I happened upon this. This is Warriors of God by a guy named James Reston. You guys may remember this book. It rang a bell with me just because, I remember kind of back in the early 2000s whenever you'd go into a Barnes & Noble or a Borders and you'd look in the history section, in the medieval section, this would be often one of the books that would be there. This is kind of your quintessential early 2000s popular history. The author is not an historian. He is more of a journalist type. He's written for Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, some publications like this. And yeah, this is just kind of a popular history. And I wanted to review some stuff in the prologue because it is remarkably bad. This is really very misleading stuff, the kind of stuff that would make historians go crazy because it's really terrible. So, but one thing I thought about was that I think that this was common stuff back in the early 2000s. I think back to that period. The internet was young. There was less available in terms of people out there looking to educate themselves on a particular topic like the Crusades. This kind of thing, I think, was easier to pass off, and I think that the book has not aged well. Let's take a look at a few little excerpts from the prologue and just kind of break them down a bit. So the very first sentence really gives you, it really gives the game away in terms of the serious problems with this book. Let's just read the very first sentence in the foreword. The Crusader movement, as it's sometimes called, stretched over a period of 200 years, unleashing a frenzy of hate and violence unprecedented before the advent of the technological age. One thing I want to really focus on is this idea in that sentence that the Crusades represented some kind of unprecedented or really just, prior to unknown and overblown type of violence and warfare. Like this image that, the medieval world was just kind of going along and then all of a sudden the Crusades showed up and created just unimaginable levels of violence and everybody was shocked by this. This is ridiculous. This is totally unhistorical. The truth is that the Crusades were a type of warfare that was normal throughout this period. I mean, when the Crusades arrived in the scene, warfare was the norm in politics throughout the Mediterranean world. The Crusades were not some kind of ramping up of the violence or, taking, the world into some new level of violence. Everybody who was engaged in battling Crusaders, like, for example, the various Muslim powers who fought Crusaders, were also fighting other Muslims. They were also fighting other Christians even in some circumstances. And if you read some of the Arab accounts of, for example, the invasions of the Seljuk Turks right before the Crusades came into Asia Minor and Syria, descriptions of the violence that the Seljuk Turks inflicted on, for example, like the Armenians is just immense. I mean, this was brutal. This was some incredibly violent stuff. And the idea that somehow the Crusades eclipsed this violence or that, this was somehow worse is just ridiculous. I mean, and that's one thing about this book. This guy really does not go into much detail at all about the Seljuk Turks for obvious reasons. Because the reality, of course, is that the expansion of the Seljuk Turks, and again, this is one example of an expanding power in the medieval Mediterranean world. The Seljuk Turks, their expansion into Syria, into Asia Minor, this was a very violent event. This was a violent conquest event. And indeed, the violence was so serious that stories of it were filtering back to the West, and this is what, in part, motivated the Crusades. This is, in part, what motivated the launching of the Crusades movement by the popes. Which brings us to another word that comes up in this ridiculous first sentence, and that is the word hate. He says that the Crusades unleashed this frenzy of hate, like the Crusades were motivated by hate. I think what's ridiculous about this is it's just a misleading and imprecise term. Their view of Islam was really the view of just kind of this generic pagan, non-Christian enemy. In many ways, they identified Islam in language that was similar to how in the Old Testament the enemies of the Israelites were identified. So the motivating factor behind the Crusades was not really so much about who they were fighting, but about the cause they were fighting for. If you look at the language from the time, the preaching of the popes and other churchmen, the charters that describe, the motivations of various crusaders, they talk about wanting to bring help to the Christians of the East. So arguably this was a major motivation of the Crusades, was this idea of actually Christian brotherly love. This has to be taken into account when you're examining the Crusades, and I'm not saying this was the only motivation for the Crusades. There was all sorts of other motivations. There was just a love of adventure, of course also material motivations as well. But leaving this out and not taking this into account is really ridiculous. And again, going back to this phrase he uses, an unprecedented frenzy of hate and violence. Is that what he says? Yeah, unleashing a frenzy of hate and violence unprecedented before the advent of the technological age. I think it's really important to emphasize the reality that when the Crusades arrived, like when the First Crusade showed up in Syria and Palestine, this was a region that had been a battleground of empires for centuries, really going back before the Middle Ages even. The Old Testament itself describes contests of power in this region. But anyway, going back to just the Crusades era, the eve of the Crusades, like the late 11th century, at the time that the Crusades showed up, this territory was being fought over by the Fatimids of Egypt, this Shiite Muslim power. They were fighting the Seljuk Turks, who were a Sunni power. In fact, right before the Crusades besieged Jerusalem, a year before this happened, there was a battle for Jerusalem between the Fatimids and the Seljuk Turks. The Turks had held it, and the Fatimids captured Jerusalem from the Turks. And then, of course, the Byzantines were fighting the Fatimids for this territory, so the Byzantine Christians of the East. The Byzantines were fighting the Seljuk Turks. All sorts of localized Arab warlords and principalities were fighting each other, as well as fighting the various major powers just mentioned. So it's just ridiculous to act like the Crusades showed up and just brought something unprecedented into this region. Really what happened is the Crusades showed up and became one more power player in the contest for Syria-Palestine. And in fact, this is kind of how they were received by the various local powers. They made alliances with the various factions. Because one thing we see throughout the history of the Crusades is that crusading powers were making alliances with various Muslim powers. In fact, when the army of the First Crusade showed up, a lot of people assumed it was just a Byzantine mercenary force because it looked like many of the armies that the Byzantines had used. The truth is that the Byzantines at this time were employing Western mercenaries on a large scale, so a lot of these Byzantine armies would have included many Westerners. So it wouldn't have been some huge shock to the region to see a Christian army containing, many of these, Western cavalrymen, Norman cavalrymen to show up. I think also this idea that the Crusades as holy war, like this was a new thing. The truth is that holy war was not a new thing at all, in the medieval world. The Islamic conquests, the early Islamic conquests, which began, 4 centuries before the Crusades, this was religiously motivated warfare. These were conquests for the cause of religion, in part at least, just like the Crusades. This was a dramatic expansion of the Arab world, of the Muslim world. Many Christian territories were captured by the Muslims, and this was considered, religiously sanctioned. This was God's will, according to the Muslim conquerors. So the Crusades are, again, another chapter in holy war, and indeed sort of a late-coming chapter. The clash between Byzantium and Islam that took place in the early Middle Ages, well before the Crusades, this was, warfare with religious sensibilities behind it. The battle in Spain, the Muslims conquered almost all of Spain, and then they were fighting the northern Christians of the Asturian kingdom. this was a religious warfare as well. So it's just, ridiculous to act as though the Crusades represent something new in that, holy war was new. Holy war was not new at all. In fact, holy war is not new to the medieval world. We have a type of holy war described in the Old Testament. And that's one thing about this book is this author does not at all really go into much detail about the early Arab conquests. The dramatic expansion of Islam in the early medieval world, this was a hugely impactful thing. This totally shaped the Mediterranean world, really from then on. Over the course of the Middle Ages, this was one of the biggest events. Now, I think the passages I'm going to read now, these are very telling passages. And what I think this is an example of is how present day, like 20th, 21st century issues can really hinder a person from understanding the past, especially if you're kind of projecting those issues onto the medieval world. Like, look at this. He says, "Until this day, Saladin remains a preeminent hero of the Islamic world. It was he who united the Arabs, who defeated the Crusaders in epic battles, who recaptured Jerusalem, and who threw the European invaders out of Arab lands." This is a thing that comes up a lot in this book, as he describes, Syria, Palestine as this Arab territory. And as you get into the modern world, you can kind of see more how someone would take that perspective, because these areas of the world are more thoroughly incorporated into kind of Arab civilization, kind of the Arab sphere of the world today. But this is not true at all in the Middle Ages. Syria, for example, was still heavily Greek. And I also think it's really funny, to describe Saladin as though he is some sort of representative of the Arab world. Saladin was a Muslim, and he was a, important Muslim ruler, but he was Kurdish, and he was not at all from this part of the world. He came from what is today Iraq. He was not a native of this territory that was being fought over by the Crusaders and by the Muslims. So when we look at Saladin fighting the Crusaders, or, the Crusaders fighting the Fatimids, the other major Muslim power that the Crusaders, battled with for control of the Holy Land, or the Crusaders fighting the Seljuk Turks, again, one of the other major powers. These opponents of the Crusaders are all also foreign entities. These are groups that came into the area and conquered, colonized, set up empires in the area. So it's not as though the Crusaders were fighting the local people. They were, again, fighting other invading forces. So the Crusaders come in and they fight other invaders in their invasion. And again, this is very typical of what is the situation in Syria, Palestine over the centuries. This is a territory that is a battleground for empires. The Seljuk Turks were an invading force. They invaded, they conquered this area. The Fatimids were an invading force. They were based in Egypt. They invaded, they took control of parts of Palestine, Syria. They fought the Byzantines in this region. The Byzantines were also, not a native force to this region. So the Crusaders come in, and they are one more foreign power, battling for control of the region. Here's another quote from the book. "Saladin's total victory over the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin is held up today as the everlasting symbol of Arab triumph over Western interference." Again, this is imposing the modern world on the medieval past. In our world today, we live in a world that's been shaped by the fact that the West has had recently this dominance over the world, Western colonialism, etc. But in the Middle Ages, the West, like the Latin Christian world is the equivalent, was not the great power of the day. The Byzantine world, the Muslim world, these were generally more powerful forces at this period of time. So when the Crusaders showed up, it wasn't as if, the domineering force in the world was showing up and imposing itself on the region. Again, the Crusaders show up, they are one more power among many that is contesting rule in this region. I think we should also make note of the fact that Islam itself as a religion is not native to Palestine. Before Islam ever existed in Palestine or Syria, the battlegrounds of the Crusades, these regions were mostly Christian. So, again, Islam comes to this part of the world during the great Arab conquests of the 7th century. So, once again, I'm just reminded of the fact that the Crusades fit into this much bigger context of, a series of battles and wars and, expansions that happened throughout the Middle Ages. And the great Muslim expansion comes well before the expansion of the Latin Christian world into the East. So, again, it's just kind of silly, Islam is not the native religion of this territory. Neither is Christianity, incidentally. But, it's imbalanced to not take this into account. To present the Crusades as this foreign imposition without also making note of the fact that Islam was a conquering force in this region, that the religion of Islam came to this region through conquest. Yeah, it's not honest, and it doesn't really get to the truth of the history. All right, now I'm going to end with one of the most ridiculous statements in this book, and that is this. But there is nothing in Islamic history that rivals the terror of the Crusades or the Christian fanaticism of the 12th century. This is just so ridiculous and so obviously false. First of all, describing this period of time as this period of terror and fanaticism. I guess we could say the same thing about the early Arab conquests. Absurd, hysterical language. And the idea that the Crusades, there's nothing in the earlier Muslim conquests to compare to what was going on in the Crusades is simply false. Look at the history of Spain, for example. The Muslims conquered Spain, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, only a tiny sliver of Christian territory remained in the north, the Kingdom of Asturias. And between the 8th century and the early 11th century, the Muslim first Emirate of Cordoba and then Caliphate of Cordoba really dominated all of Spain. This was the hegemonic power in Spain. And for centuries, the Emirs of Cordoba, then the Caliphs of Cordoba would launch these almost annual raids into the Christian territory. They would burn villages, terrorize things, generally what's done in raids. Many people were killed, property was destroyed, entire cities were destroyed, and thousands upon thousands of slaves were taken back into the Muslim territory, to live the rest of their lives in bondage. Nowhere does Reston mention this, And again, I'm not pointing this out to somehow say that only Muslim armies did this sort of thing. Everybody raided. Christian armies conducted raids as well. There's plenty of violence and raiding throughout the history of Christendom and Christian armies. But again, it's just dishonest to say that there's nothing prior to the Crusades in the history of Islam that compares. It's simply not true. In fact, the expansion of Islam in the early Arab conquests and, some of the stuff that was done to subject Christian populations, the raids that were carried out. Also, we should point out that Italy, when the Muslims conquered Sicily in the 9th century, Italy was very much dangerous because of piracy. So the coastlines of Italy were, harassed by Muslim pirates for a couple of centuries. It wasn't until the Normans conquered Sicily in the 11th century that this was brought to an end. I don't know, this is pretty violent, pretty brutal. Does this compare to the horrors of the Crusades, Mr. Reston? Again, it's just not honest, and there's an imbalance there. Let's be honest about the reality of medieval warfare. Let's examine the truth about how warfare was conducted throughout the Middle Ages, the fact that raiding and this kind of thing was it was done by everybody. The reality is that the raid was carried out by every power in the medieval world. So just to conclude, this is a really terrible book. It's not an accurate history at all. It's not even a good popular history. I think that you can write a popular history, and people who are not historians can write popular histories, but they have an obligation to be faithful to the legitimate scholarship, to present a balanced and to present something that is helpful rather than misleading. And again, I also think that this is kind of a good example of some of the stuff that was floating around more frequently in the early 21st century, kind of the first, the early 2000s. This kind of thing still does show up, but I do think it's less. It's harder to pass this kind of thing off now. I really do think so. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. And just a last word here. I want to say thanks very much to Other Realm Productions. I just want to recognize him. Other Realm Productions has been doing a lot of really good video game clips for my videos. He's very good at that. I'm very much in debt to him for his excellent work. He has a YouTube channel himself, which is very good. I have a link to it down below. He's really good with this kind of cinematic video game presentation thing, and I feel like it's really helped my videos a lot. So Other Realm, thank you so much. I appreciate your help on the videos. You've done a great job. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available on Amazon. Click on the link on the screen to purchase your copy, or follow the link in the About box of this video.